Okay, today we have invited Gerry Robinson, who's a resident of Stephentown and knows all about the Freedom Riders. It's going to be quite a program, so I would ask if you have any questions for Gerry to please hold off until the end of the presentation. You can ask Gerry anything you want within reason during refreshment time. Thank you. Gerry?
Thank you. This doesn't fit into this, does it?
It's in this other one, hold on.
Oh. It seems even more complicated. That's what it is. That's fine. You're good. Everybody hear me?
No.
No? Well, good afternoon. Thank God for the big thaw. We're dog yesterday morning. It was 17 up where we are, and 17 below, and wind chill, I don't know what it was, probably 35. My dog looked at me like I was crazy when I had to go out and protect it. I'd like to thank President Arlene Longo and the Stephentown Historical Society Board for hosting this event and an opportunity to say a word about Black history. Last December, I turned 84 years old, and I decided that I probably had lived through a lot of Black history, so mostly what I did in preparation for this was simply to reflect on where I'd come from and what my experiences were. My personal perspective on racial conflict in America is somewhat skewed by my own upbringing. I'm a fourth generation Kansan on both sides. You need more? Hold on, I'll put it closer. All right, is that better? I'm a fourth generation Kansan on both sides. As I mentioned when I did my other presentation here several years back, it's kind of interesting growing up. My mother was a Catholic convert, and a Protestant. So I grew up in a state and a town that I was, Kansas is probably one of the most Republican states in the country, and I dare say mostly Protestant and different Protestant denominations. So I grew up Black. My grandmother was a FDR Democratic convert. Losing it again?
Gotta get right up close, Gerry. Otherwise it won't. Bad sound.
All right.
Gotta hold it.
Thank you.
Racial conflict in America has been around for about 404 years now. It started obviously in part, at least in terms of Black racial conflict, with the slavery period, which is generally pegged at around 1619. So about 404 years ago. And in all of that 404 years, there has been conflict, and there has been different sides on this incredibly complex issue. My own experience has been that people who are exposed to one another in some reasonable environment tend to educate themselves about race. I consider two of the most seminal civil rights events in the history of civil rights is the, first of all, when President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces back in the late 40s, early 50s, and the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education integration of schools. Up to that point, most southern states, and particularly the most southern southern states, followed a pattern of slavery that started in 1619 and theoretically ended at the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, I believe. But the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves. It just was a proclamation of the intent to do so. And so slavery didn't really end until 1865 with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So then the next era of race relations was Reconstruction. And it was an effort to provide training, education opportunities for ex-slaves to become gainfully employed and educated and trained and in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different Reconstruction programs. At the same time, there was the evolving of the Ku Klux Klan and other hate and domestic violence groups. A lot of lynching, a lot of burning at the stake, and that kind of thing. It really heinous stuff. And the Jim Crow accommodation laws were in most states. I grew up in the 40s and the 50s. I went to grade school in the 40s, middle school, high school in the 50s. And so for the first the first 25 years of my life, there was a predominance of Jim Crow public accommodation laws in most states. And the Jim Crow doctrine, pretty much similar to apartheid in South Africa, was clear to have a rigid separation of races. It was worse in the Deep South than it was in other states. But where I grew up in Hutchinson, Kansas, and I never went to an integrated school, a segregated school, because in the Midwest there were waivers for smaller towns and whatnot that couldn't afford to build separate school facilities. My high school class, I think there was maybe 6 black kids in it. So you don't build a high school for 20 or 30 kids. And so they had these waivers set up so that if you couldn't afford to have 2 school systems, that you would get waived at least through most of the grade levels. At the same time, Wichita and Topeka were both major court cases in terms of school integration. And but during those times, it set I would say a platform. I'm very hopeful of the millennials and the Gen Z population coming up, because the two things that those two events did was that it provided an opportunity for people to look at each other through their own eyes and make their own judgments about whether somebody had two heads or was crazy or the majority of them were criminals or whatever. And so the epiphany for me, I was terribly afraid of the South. But growing up, in Hutchinson, I couldn't attend the city swimming pool. There were 4 theaters, 3 of which I could go to, but had to sit in the balcony. The other one I couldn't go to at all because it didn't have a balcony. And there was a recreation center that had Tuesday night for blacks. There were no black Boy Scouts, and there were no black members of regular Boy Scout troops. There was no seating at restaurants. You could get an order at the back door if you picked it up. In the Deep South, there were obviously separate drinking fountains and all that. And so when I graduated from high school in 1956, and my next goal was to get my military obligation out of the way in those days. And after looking at the situation, I decided to join the Navy. And the sole reason for joining the Navy was that the other 2 branches of service was more likely than not to be stationed somewhere in the South to go through basic training. Whereas in the Navy, the 2 basic training sites were San Diego and Great Lakes in Illinois. And I quite frankly was deadly afraid of going south. After talking to people from Kansas that had immigrated from the South and talked about the different issues that went on in the South, particularly the ones where there was a lot of violence and people lynched and burned at the stake, I just felt like if I got stationed in the South, I wouldn't come out alive. I just couldn't find a way that I would have fit in any of those situations. So I spent a 6-year enlistment in the Navy. Now, getting back to this issue of exposing ourselves to each other and making our own informed judgments about people that are different than you are, and diversity. I had my own moment of epiphany in the Navy. I was terribly afraid of Southern accents. The Southern accent, I heard Southern accent, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. And so when I was stationed, I went through boot camp and hospital corps training in San Diego, and then I was transferred to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. And they had dorms with cubicles with 2 beds and 2 lockers. And when I first was transferred there, I had a cubicle to myself, and which was a luxury, but it went up and down depending on how many people got transferred in and how many people got transferred out. But for several months, I had a cubicle to myself. I came back from my job one afternoon, and I heard this deep Southern accent coming from the row my cubicle was on. And that was bad enough, and I hope it's not my cubicle. And sure enough, I got to my cubicle. I was introduced to my new cube-mate, a young kid named James Parker from South Carolina. Well, I didn't know what to do. I tried to avoid any contact at all, but and he was he's a Robbie. You going to chow now? You want to go to chow together? And I'm like, I guess stuff to do. I can make some excuse. And then finally one day a group of us were going on break. Going on liberty, and we're going to go to have a beer in Bethesda, and then go to a movie that we wanted to see. And there were 6 or 7 of us, about half and half, 3 or 4 white, 3 or 4 black. And we went into a bar in Bethesda and ordered beers, and the bartender said, but I said to one of the white guys, Navy guys, I can serve you, but I can't serve your friends. And of course, in those days, we were used to that. It didn't really bowl us over or anything. And we said, fine, we'll go into DC and go to a black theater. And so we left, the 3 or 4 of us that were black, and we're walking down the street, and I hear footsteps behind, and we look around, and it was Parker. And Parker said, where are you guys going? I said, well, we're going into D.C. And he said, why? I said, because we can't get served there. And he said, oh, well, we're all going to D.C., I guess. And so we all got on a trolley and we went to D.C. My moment of epiphany then was that I clearly had a prejudice against Parker that was unjustified, unknowledgeable, and I, from that point on, I tried to judge people not by characteristics, but by the content of their character, and it was a big shift in my psyche in those days. After Reconstruction and the rising of the Ku Klux Klan and violence groups, really horrible violence. I mean, and the thing about it was that people, they became kind of entertainment. You know, they have a lynching or burning the stake in the town square, and people for miles around would come and lift their children up to watch the lynching or the. One time they burned a pregnant woman, and at some point her unborn fetus dropped out of the body and into the fire. So they were really, my fear of going south for basic training was real. And in 1954, of course, there's a movie out now about Emmett Till. He was killed in Mississippi and his body mutilated and thrown into the river. So the Jim Crow public accommodation laws in most of the states at that point really involved just keeping the races separate, but also things like suppression of vote for blacks. And there's all kinds of stories about how that got turned. But the foundation of the conflict was state rights, and from state rights evolved from a Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the principle of separate but equal. So the segregation was all right as long as it was equal. Well, there was no way that it was equal. It was never going to be equal. But that doctrine stood until the 1954 Supreme Court decision, which through tons of data, both scientific and otherwise, fairly substantially proved that the separate is never equal. Just doesn't work out that way. And so, and with the suppression of the vote, kind of, well, it wasn't really all that creative, but they would do things like put 100 jelly beans in a jar, and if a black person went to the registrar to register, you'd have to guess how many jelly beans were in the jar. Another story is that another state used IQ, and IQ was a black guy would come in to register and they'd say spell Mesopotamia or some long word, and they'd say you didn't pass, so you can't vote. And at the same time, the white guy behind him in line, they said spell cat, and he spelled it K-A-T, and they said close enough. So that was the issues of separate but equal, and states' rights versus constitutionally protected rights, most of which started in the 50s and 60s, and there were a lot of favorable Supreme Court rulings to deal with all of those issues, including separate but equal and what we just said with the oath, liberty and justice for all. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were actually civil rights decisions, essentially. I mean, they essentially said everybody gets treated equal. The Constitution says that no state can take my constitutional rights or liberties away. Everybody gets treated the same way. And I say all this because by my own perspective, I think that, first of all, I don't call it Black history, although I'm very proud of all the things that Black history illuminates, the contributions that blacks have made to America. A civil rights leader not too long ago made a quote that I won't forget. He said, Black Americans have been better to America than America's been to Black Americans. And all of my family, I know in every generation, has been to every war, including my great-grandfather, who was a slave and walked from Missouri to Kansas and joined the 10th Cavalry. My dad, who was in World War II. My Uncle Ray was in World War I. My brother, who was a Marine in Vietnam. And that's not an unusual pattern for most Black American families during that period. I've come to believe that I don't think of it as Black history. I think of it as American history. And I don't really have much of an urge to discuss or argue with people about whether history is important and whether it can be manipulated or changed or hidden or whatever. It is what it is. It's history, and Black history is a part of American history, an important part of American history. And this thing that's been going on for 400 years just keeps repeating itself and keeps turning over with the same issues, really, whether it's voter suppression or other kinds of racial discrimination. And I guess my firm hope and belief is that in every confrontation, sooner or later, the good guys win over the bad guys. I've always had an abiding faith about that with America, is that the majority of American people were the good guys. Took different ways and different times for them to get excited about stuff that was going on with the treatment of Black Americans in the early to mid 60s. It took 4 little Black girls going to Sunday school in the basement of a Baptist church in Birmingham, blown up by dynamite. The Will Connors, the chief of police of Birmingham, also set German shepherds and high-pressure fire hoses on peaceful demonstrators in the city park. And at some point, and of course John Lewis got his head almost broke open. At some point, the better angels, the good people, the good American people, say enough's enough, and they rise up. So I've always felt that it was a case of there are people who have a lot of hate and a lot of fear and a lot of violence for a variety of reasons. But they've never been the majority of Americans, and they never will be. They didn't win the Civil War. They didn't win shutting down Reconstruction with violence and terror. And evil has been with us since day one, I guess. And I think it always will be. I think it'll always be a struggle of some kind, if not over this issue, over any issue. We're just all different individual people who have different ways in which we've grown up. But I think that at the end of the day, it will be people that have humanistic values that will dominate this country sooner or later. All of the major religions, no matter which one you want to talk about, despite labels and everything else, embrace humanistic values. The golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. 10 Commandments. You don't go around and steal and rob and lie and do whatever that you want to do. Those are all values that I know I was raised with, and most people were raised with. And I think those are ultimately the ones that will prevail. Now, 18 years ago, 19 years this summer, 18 years ago, Paula and I moved to Stephentown. And we were incredibly excited about it. We loved the property that we bought. We were very excited about starting a new phase of life. And the second day we were there, I went down to the mailbox, and there was the sweetest letter from my neighbor a block away, Albert Gordon. And it was just a letter welcoming us to Round Mountain Road and a little box of chocolates. And at another point, when Paul was talking to him, he was preparing grape jelly to attract Orioles to his house. And so Paula was very curious about that. So she said, so how does that work? And so he went through every step about what he did and how they used the grape jelly. And the next day, there was a jar of grape jelly in our mailbox. So Al and I were neighbors and friends for 18 years. When I learned of his death last year, I was stunned, but I came home and I told Paul about it, who was also stunned. But we weren't really that stunned yet. Paul had Googled Albert's name and found out that he was a freedom rider. And you have to understand all the background I just gave you about how dangerous it was to go south. It didn't make any difference whether you were black or white or whatever you were. You were an intruder, and particularly if you were trying to help people register to vote or fight against segregated public accommodations or whatever the battle or the struggle was. And those armies of the good guys were people of all denominations, all faiths, all colors, fighting for what they thought was right. And the fight is always dependent upon people recognizing or responding to a social conscience about what's right and what's wrong. And Albert, in all of the 18 years that I knew him, never mentioned a word about being a freedom rider. Not a word. And not only that, when I talked to his widow, who was his business partner starting out back in the early 1970s, and then became his wife, he didn't mention it to her until 1989. He was a very modest man. And that what he must have gone through to think about what the risks were that he was putting himself to and whatnot, must have been tremendous. But I'll let him tell you.
Hollow when you're ready.
Get it.
All right. If I could, have you state your name and age, what you're doing now, where you grew up, and so forth.
How many hours you say? My name is Albert Gordon. I'm 67. I was 27 when I came to Jackson for the Freedom Ride. I was actually born in Belgium. Came here when I was 7 years old to the United States. So I'm fully educated in the States, which means I'm really totally American. More so even in emotional terms, because there's only one country that can make me furious, and that's the United States, because it's my country, and it's very special for me. So it's when I say anger and fury, it's at, curiously enough, the issues of justice and injustice that reach me so deeply. I've reflected long and hard over the years what creates a social conscience. Never really resolved that issue. And I think about my own past, my personal past, my family past, my education, all the things that comprise a human being, and I compare myself to other members of my family and close and dear friends, and I still haven't been able to sort it out as to why some of us feel so profoundly on certain issues of morality, of public morality, of ethics, of justice, those notions, and how we differ. Why some of us have been ready to do things and others not. At any rate, for my own past, I was born in Europe, and I did see the Nazis, and most of my family was killed by the Nazis during World War II in the concentration camps because I was Jewish, nominally Jewish. And so those things can explain in part my social conscience, but by no means altogether. But certainly they played a role in my connecting the social forms of misbehavior in the South to my own historical connection to Europe. And when I did see the young people first in the first sit-ins and the courage that they had to have, and saw then later, a couple of years later, the bus in Anniston and Jim Peck being so brutally beaten, I felt I just had to do something, and simply volunteered and proceeded.
Can you tell us a little bit about the story of when you volunteered and where
Oh,
you were?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was teaching then. I was already a high school teacher. I've become, in the last 30 years or so, an art dealer, and that's really what I am. But I was a teacher at first, and there was a meeting called to discuss the things in the South. So I went with no idea really of what I would be doing, but when it became apparent that the Corps was actively looking for volunteers, I immediately volunteered, without consultation, without too much reflection, knowing that this was a visceral act that I simply had to participate in. And it was interesting that there were a number of other teachers and people that I'd known in the room, and many people expressed similar sentiments, but it wound up that I was the only one to go. Again, what is it that keeps somebody on the track and distracts others? I don't think I was any more or less courageous. I was petrified, and going down on the bus, there were 5 of us that went down from New York, and we stayed on the bus all together right through, and when we started going through the South, we were very nervous, because then we were having discussions. Well, here we are in South Carolina, and look at the public accommodations, maybe we should do something here. We're already gearing ourselves up to do something, but we figure we better wait till our appointed time. But the further we got down, the more paranoid we got, because people were looking at the bus and at us. And it was obvious to me that somebody had tipped them off as to who was in that bus. So we were getting more and more nervous, and as we got to Jackson and we saw the crowd surrounding the bus, I remember it was a very shaky proposition, but we all did go down. And we were met by Tom Gaither, whom I remember with great admiration. Tom is here, and he was the Corps organizer for about a year, living here, setting things up. And he gathered us together, and we couldn't get, no taxi cab would take us. We decided not to integrate the facilities right there at then, but to go and to go into the community for a few days. This was his plan, and we followed along. We didn't know what was going to happen, because the crowds were there. There was police, but we knew what side they were on. and yet he steered us clear and into the street. God, I hadn't remembered that before. Into the street, walked for a ways, and finally found a taxi that would let us pile in, and went into the black community, which was unforgettable to me. Those few days that we spent before going and testing the facilities and getting arrested, the not camaraderie, but the connection between people was so profound. You know, the sense of brotherhood, the sense of togetherness. You know, these can be very corny expressions when used in a banal sense, but it was in the most profound sense. And I have never felt that since then, that kind of bond between people so utterly different, but so totally united in an objective and in a clear vision of what was moral and what was immoral in societal terms. And never forget the different families, the older people, the younger people, and because we recognized we were really still outsiders, and that, yeah, we would do what we were meant to do, and maybe we'd get hurt in the process, and we were willing, but these are the people that were going to continue to live in that environment with all the consequences that we wouldn't be able to foresee. So they really had our most profound respect and affection and gratitude for welcoming us and taking care of us, while, you know, out there was, you know, that's the stormtroopers were waiting to stop us. Anyway, so after a few days and lots of great singing and lots of great connecting, we decided on the course of action, and we went to the Trailway station. And black went to white, white went to black, and good old Captain Ray gave us his choice of, you know, to, I don't know, I forgot what his exact words are. I think they're on the record, but you're under arrest. And then started the whole arrest process. We were booked, and we stayed in the city jail for a couple of days. I don't even remember, to tell you the truth. And then we went up to Parchman, where I stayed for 39 days, and waiting for the release so that we could appeal. We had a few terrible scares along the way. We didn't think we were going to make it to Parchman. That's what we were most scared about, that they were going to stop the paddy wagon somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just unleash the dogs, you know, whatever it was, and just pounce on us. So that was rather scary. And then we got to Parchman, and then we went through the whole process, and it was quite an eventful 39 days. And it was fabulous to see people I haven't seen in 40 years. I mean, really very, very touching. And catch up on our various lives, which are so different from, you know, I mean, we represent every every profession, every I don't know, orientation, or that 300 or 350 people can possibly represent, of which we're only a tiny minority, but I suppose we're representative of all the people who are on the ride.
Getting back to when you first made the decision to go, what was the reaction of your family and friends?
To tell you the truth, I didn't discuss it. I was very happy that my parents were off in Europe, and I didn't tell my sister either. Nor did I didn't even discuss it. It was almost the beginning of, you know, I may have, and I don't even remember. I remember that I just needed to do it myself. I had my own apartment. So I was older than a lot of the kids around. I was by 3 or 4 years. I was 27. And no, I didn't have my own apartment. I didn't. I was still living with my parents. But nobody was home. So, and I didn't want to upset them, because they all being of European being European and having certain attitudes towards authority, there was a big difference between them and me. I was American, and with all the outrage that only a young American can feel about his own country. And they would have counseled me strongly against it, and they were very, very upset when they learned, because I wrote to my sister from jail, from parchment, and she told me, and I can't find the letter, unfortunately, she told me how, I mean, she was incredulous about where I was, and shared it with my parents. Of course, everybody was extremely nervous and worried about my well-being, having seen, you know, the newspapers all over the country for the preceding year or two about what was happening. But I was upset with family subsequently. You see, I became very active for that whole of the 1960s, the civil rights and many, many demonstrations, and even other arrests and civil rights, and in the anti-Vietnam War period, which is the 60s, until I started my gallery in earnest in like 69, and that was a big distraction, but I was still active. And it was great disappointment to me to see the reaction of some of my family, survivors all of European fascism. And I saw that that infection of racism had permeated even parts, not all, parts of my family, which was to this day shocking to me. People who had escaped the Holocaust by the skin of their teeth had assimilated the dominant American racist attitudes so that they couldn't understand the motivation of somebody who was safe and who was okay to help, couldn't make the connection between the situation of black Americans with the experience in the world of others who are victims. So we had Homeric battles in the family, but for much of the family, I came to be regarded with some esteem, I suppose, for having done what some of them later considered was a desirable and good act. So I was redeemed in their eyes, so to speak. Yeah.
Do you remember being released from jail? What you did when you got out?
Actually, yeah, I do. I spent very little time, and Tom just told me now that the matter of policy was to get people away as quickly as possible, being afraid that we were already so hopped up as we were that we were going to get in trouble again, and which would compound the situation. But I remember I went to see a girlfriend in Jamaica, the West Indies. And, you know, I remember I had not seen the papers in weeks. And so I wasn't aware that it had made such an immense impact on America and on the world. You know, I did what I had to do. And so I went down there, and you know, she asked me, well, where'd I come from? And I told her, you know, and it was amazing to see the reaction of her and of everybody else down there. I said, you know, I couldn't quite understand why they were reacting so strongly and favorably to what the freedom rides represented. But for me, there was a disconnect because I was in jail and didn't know what was going on outside, you know, for all that time. So it was interesting. But so I went down there and stayed there for 2 good weeks, and then came back to New York, and of course understood much more clearly what was the impact of what we were doing.
Do you remember any specific incidents of violence perpetrated upon you?
Are you talking in connection with the Freedom Ride? Or?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was always the fear and the unknown. And at any time, something terrible could happen. So never got assaulted, never was a subject of actual physical violence. I did come back in 1965, I forgot, and I came back also for Selma and for a couple of other things. But in 1965, I spent the summer living right next door to Fannie Lou Hamer. You must know. And she was a heroine already, and I was just lucky that I was placed in the house next to hers for the whole summer because I was doing voter registration. And that was really, I felt very proud to be, on a friendly basis with her. And I was begging her to please dictate, because I have all the secretarial skills. I take shorthand and I'm fast typist. To dictate to me her memoirs. And I would stay after her and she would put me off. I think she just didn't want to do it. Didn't want to do it. And I don't think she ever did. But it was really, again, an unforgettable experience. Going to church with her and with my host and hostess, living as like a sharecropping family, really. It was no electricity in the house. Maybe it was one light. And no refrigerator, that I remember. And working in voter registration during that time. And then I was also a lot of close calls because we were driving, I had my little Volkswagen where I was driving people to the courthouse to register. And of course they knew who I was and we were stopped any number of times and I had to produce all my documents and any one of those times could have led to anything. So it's the constant stress and the fear. But hey, I was determined and I was ideological and I was motivated, and the support of the local community was really incredible. So, no, fortunately, I never was subject to actual physical assault.
What do you remember most? Is there any one thing that stands out? Is it an experience or an event that...
Other than those incidences of fear, it was really the bonding with people, the connectedness with people who are united in one objective, and that's just for me. It will always be the paramount recollection. Plus, our political objective. What it was that we were trying to achieve, and we wanted to shake it up, and got shook up a little.
How active did you remain past when you came to register voters? Beyond that, was more of an immersion in the anti-war movement?
Yeah, well, the whole,
time frame wise?
Yeah, civil rights was very big from 61 till 66, 67, 68. And then the anti-war movement really took off. And then we had our big discussions and all the big schisms within the movement of black and white, which was a most regrettable thing that happened. And so many white people, felt, their energies were they allowed their energies to be directed to other, also very demanding and important places instead of civil rights. As that developed its own and different trajectory. I remember I had big arguments with Stokely Carmichael, whom I knew in New York, and with whom I flew down, by the way, to Selma. And we had huge arguments because that was just the beginning of the Black Power, expressing Black Power. So, and Stokely, as great as he was at one point, I gotta say, I heard him at the end of his life, and he was such a rabid racist, and I had to walk out. Once I really had a big argument with him in public about some terribly anti-Semitic things that he said, and I was just utterly shocked, and it was inexcusable, and I called him a simple motherfucker, and a whole bunch of other things. So, but I was very active. in the civil rights, and then in the sorry about that. That's going to register. And then in the anti-war, I was really very close to all the leaders of the anti-war period, and still very good friends with Norma Becker, Dave Dellinger. I know of. I don't know if you guys have studied all that stuff, but and A.J. Musty, who was one of our heroes and already was much older when it all began, and the immense internecine arguments, because we were trying to create a coalition between all the religious, all the really the ardent religious people, and then the communists, and then everything in between. And in order to coalesce a group of people, I mean, that took a lot of doing. But then we started, of course, with the big marches down Fifth Avenue. It was all very heady, exciting things. Again, when the right thing seemed to be so clear, so clear. And of course, we were in the great minority at first, but it built up very quickly, so that we finally became the majority. And never quite succeeded to such an extent on racial issues, much more profound and more difficult to budge. But yeah, until, listen, I'm active. I still, write vitriolic letters. I still, to the New York Times. I've always been, I've always been a loudmouth, and I've always felt things deeply, and do things.
Sure. I haven't skipped anything. I've been asking everyone this question. I don't
Oh, okay.
pigeonhole you. You certainly don't have to. But do you have a favorite freedom song that you remember?
Oh, it became really corny after a while, and so now it's coming back. And of course, it's the "We Shall Overcome" that. That would be stated, that would be sung under such special conditions of stress. So that's probably it.
In the context, it achieves a whole different meaning.
No, in the context of in the early '60s, and then later on, it was really like repeated too often and made banal by some singers, perhaps, but during the time that it was called upon to perform its function of inspiration, it did just that. And I, not being at all a religious, being an outright atheist and very much of the left, as a matter of fact, I've gotten more radical, by the way, as I've gotten older. Yeah, pretty consistently. So I didn't know the songs. I didn't know the religious songs. I knew some of the popular folk songs and the Pete Seeger things. And I knew also in New York in the 1950s, because we did have even some demonstrations there, but that was tiny stuff. So I really had no involvement on a personal basis in dissent actively, really, before the Freedom Ride. And that for me was watershed period in my own life. But before, and so I wasn't familiar with the songs really, and so when I heard them here, under battle conditions, they were special.
Care to sing a bar or two?
No. Thanks for the invitation. It's okay.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure. I hope this is of some use.
I need to do just two more things. Albert's widow, Judy, still lives on Round Mountain Road. injured herself towards the end of the summer. Actually, see, I didn't realize how serious it was because when she told me about it, she said, I ran over myself. And I said, what do you mean you ran over yourself? And she was actually at Larry's farm buying corn, and she got back in her car. She was driving a Jeep. She got back in her car and remembered something that she forgot to pick up. So she went back to the farmstead, picked up whatever it was, and when she looked back, the car was moving. So she tried to get in and she ran over her leg, and I guess it very badly mashed the leg. They thought that she would be mobile again in December, but the doctors in December said that it may be as late as June before she heals enough to be able to get therapy and rehabilitate. But in any case, she was thrilled to know that we would have this celebration of Albert's life, and she asked me to pass on her gratitude for all of you that showed up. That's the end of my presentation. I have, in summary, I would say, to me again, it's good guys versus bad guys, or bad guys versus good guys, whatever. Slavery was run by bad guys, but there were more good guys than there were bad guys that opposed it. Harriet Beecher Stowe when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin was so illuminating in terms of how the truth about how slave families were treated and things that they had to go through, but it literally moved a nation. It moved the world. I mean, there was something like 3 million copies sold in the first, I don't know, month or so internationally, and it moved. Some people say it moved this country to the Civil War. There are good guys and heroes in every one of the aspects of the bad guys, whether it's voter suppression, Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow, segregation laws, you name it. My purpose here today is not to condemn or to complain about the bad guys. I really don't care about that. I care about the good guys, and it was a wonderful opportunity to thank all of the good guys down through that 400 years. Throughout it. So, Howard was my neighbor and friend for 18 years, and as a freedom fighter, now that I know, he will be my hero forever. Thank you.